The noise came first, a sound so alien to the quiet working-class street that it seemed to tear a hole in the fabric of the morning. It was a rhythmic, percussive chopping that grew from a distant hum into a deafening roar, rattling the windows of the small, neatly kept houses and drawing curious, anxious faces to their front doors. Thomas Jefferson Santos, 45 years old, was washing dishes in the sink of his small kitchen. The familiar scent of soap and warm water, a comforting anchor in his predictable life. He paused, his hands submerged in the suds, and listened. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it was directly overhead, a physical pressure that seemed to press down on the roof of his house. And then, the whole neighborhood stopped. A sleek, black helicopter, a machine that looked like it belonged in a spy movie or a billionaire's fantasy, descended from the clear blue sky. It moved with a predatory grace, its powerful propellers kicking up a whirlwind of dust and dry leaves from the street. It didn't land in the nearby park, or in the schoolyard. It landed, with a breathtaking, impossible precision, right in front of his small, white picket gate. Two elegant figures emerged from the aircraft, ducking under the still spinning blades. A tall man in an impeccable, dark, tailored suit and a woman of such noble, confident bearing that she seemed to radiate an aura of quiet, formidable power. They walked, not towards the mayor's house, or the local bank, but directly, purposefully, towards his front door. Thomas dried his hands slowly on a worn dish towel. He felt no panic, he felt no fear. A serene, almost beatific expression settled over his face. The expression of a man who had been waiting for a particular long overdue moment for a very, very long time. 20 years earlier, Thomas Jefferson Santos was just another black waiter, another invisible man, trying to survive in the gilded, unforgiving world of the Golden Fork, a fine dining establishment where the wealthy and powerful of the city came to feast. He was a place where the customers barely looked at his face when they placed their orders, where his presence was as noted and as valued as that of the silverware on the table. At that time, he was 25 years old, a young man with a quiet dignity and a deep, weary sadness in his eyes. He worked double shifts, a grueling, soul-crushing routine that began before the sun rose and ended long after the moon had climbed to its zenith. Mornings were spent as a janitor in a downtown office building, the acrid smell of cleaning chemicals a constant companion. Afternoons and evenings were spent at the Golden Fork, a world of crisp, white linen, of clinking crystal, of hushed, important conversations that he was paid to overhear but never to acknowledge. He did it all for one reason: to support his sick mother, a woman whose love was the only true and unwavering light in his life. It was on a cold, bitter December night, a night when the wind howled through the city's concrete canyons like a hungry wolf, that it all began. Two small, shivering figures appeared at the back door of the restaurant, their faces pale and pinched with cold and hunger. They were orphans, a boy of 10 and his younger sister, who was 8, Eli and Nina. He would later learn their names. They had lost their parents in a sudden, violent car accident several months before, and after a brief, terrifying stint in an overcrowded and underfunded state facility, they had run away. They had been living on the streets for weeks, surviving on their wits and the occasional, grudging kindness of strangers. Thomas, whose own stomach often rumbled with a quiet, persistent hunger, did something that night that would change the course of their lives, and his own, forever. He began to sneak food to them. Every night, after the last of the wealthy patrons had departed, leaving behind a trail of half-eaten, obscenely expensive meals, Thomas would carefully, secretly, pack the leftovers into clean containers and deliver them to the two small, grateful children who waited for him in the cold, dark alley behind the restaurant. The restaurant's manager, a man named Robert Manning, a 50-year-old white man whose superiority complex was as vast and as empty as his soul, discovered Thomas's quiet, desperate act of charity after 3 weeks. "Do you think this is a free food distribution center for every stray that wanders in off the street?" he had shouted, his voice a raw, ugly sound that had echoed through the gleaming stainless steel kitchen. He had fired Thomas on the spot, in front of all the other employees, a public, humiliating execution designed to make an example of him. "You clueless, ungrateful, black man," Manning had spat, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. "You should be on your knees, thanking me for the privilege of having a job in a place like this, not giving our food away to a couple of street bums." Thomas had left silently, his cheeks burning with a shame that was not his own. But he had not stopped. He had continued to feed the children, sharing with them the little that he had at his own small, humble home, until one day, they had simply disappeared. He had searched for them for days, his heart a cold heavy stone in his chest, until he had finally learned that they had been found by the police and had been taken away by social services, sent to a distant, unknown institution in another state. Now, 20 years later, as he watched those two elegant, powerful figures approaching his front door, Thomas allowed himself a small, quiet, and deeply satisfied smile. During all those long, hard, and often painful years of working in modest, invisible jobs, of being underestimated, of being humiliated, he had kept a secret that no one, not the arrogant Robert Manning, not the other wealthy patrons of the Golden Fork, not even his own beloved mother, could ever have imagined. The humiliation at the Golden Fork, the public, racist, and deeply unjust firing, was just the beginning of Thomas's ordeal. Robert Manning, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his pettiness, was not satisfied with simply firing him. He made it his personal mission to ensure that Thomas Jefferson Santos would never work in a decent establishment in that city again. He made a series of strategic, effective, and very private phone calls to the owners of other fine dining restaurants, to the managers of the city's most exclusive private clubs, to the heads of the high-end catering companies. The story he told was a simple and very effective lie. He spoke of a problem waiter, a man he had tried to help, a man he had given a chance to, who had been caught stealing food, not just leftovers, prime cuts of meat, expensive bottles of wine. You have to understand one thing about people like him, Manning had explained, his voice a smooth, conspiratorial purr, over a lunch of steak and lobster at his own private, and very exclusive, club. You give them an inch, and they'll take a mile. I thought I was doing a good deed, you know, a bit of charity, by hiring a black guy from the inner city. But they always show their true colors in the end. And so, Thomas was blacklisted. He scoured the city for any kind of work, his quiet dignity a stark, and often painful, contrast to the menial, and often humiliating, jobs he was forced to take. He washed cars, his hands raw and chapped from the cold water and the harsh chemicals. He delivered flyers, walking miles and miles through the city's indifferent streets, his feet aching, his spirit weary. He cleaned offices in the deep dark, lonely hours of the morning, the silent, empty buildings, a constant and painful reminder of the vibrant, professional world from which he had been so unjustly, and so completely, exiled. His mother, Ruth, a woman whose body was failing but whose spirit was as strong and as resilient as a mountain, would watch her son come home later and later each night, his clothes dirty, his pride bruised, his eyes full of a quiet and deeply weary sadness. "My son," she would whisper, her voice a soft, gentle caress, as she tended to the small cuts and scrapes on his hands, her own hands gnarled and twisted by a diabetes that had ravaged her body for years. She depended on Thomas for everything, a fact that was a source of both profound love and a deep and constant guilt for him. "You have so much more inside you than this small and blind town can see." And she was right. What Robert Manning, what all the other powerful and prejudiced men in that city didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that Thomas Jefferson Santos had graduated, with top honors, from the state university with a degree in business administration. He had been one of the brightest, most promising students in his class. He had worked as a waiter, not because he had no other options, but because he needed the flexible hours, the cash-in-hand tips, to be able to take care of his ailing mother. For years, he had kept his diploma, his symbol of a future that had been stolen from him, in a drawer, a quiet and painful reminder of the man he was supposed to have been. He had, over time, come to accept that the world, in its blindness, saw him as just another disposable and invisible employee. But the children, Eli and Nina, had changed something inside him. They had reawakened a part of him that he had thought was long dead, a sense of purpose, a sense of justice, even after he had been fired, even when he was, at times, hungry himself. Thomas had continued to bring food to the two small, grateful orphans who waited for him in the cold, dark alley behind the Golden Fork. He had sold his few personal belongings of any value, his grandfather's old watch, his small collection of first-edition books, his own beloved college textbooks. He had taken on extra, and often humiliating, jobs, anything to make sure that those two small and deeply vulnerable children did not go to bed hungry. That it was on one of those nights, as he was walking through the wealthy, brightly lit streets of the city, carrying a heavy bag of leftovers from a wedding he had helped to clean up, that he had heard the familiar and deeply unpleasant sound of Robert Manning's braying laughter. Manning was on the wide columned porch of his private club, surrounded by a group of other wealthy, powerful businessmen. They were drinking whiskey, smoking expensive cigars, and laughing loudly. "Did you see that?" Manning had laughed, pointing a thick, manicured finger in the direction that Thomas was walking. "The thief waiter. He's still out there, picking up scraps, like a stray dog." The other men had laughed along with him, a chorus of cruel and deeply satisfied amusement. "I bet he's selling the stolen food to buy drugs," one of the other men had added. "It's always the same story with these types." Thomas had stopped. For a long silent moment, he had felt the hot, familiar, and deeply dangerous blood boil in his veins. He could have crossed the street, he could have climbed those wide, imposing marble steps, and he could have shown those men, those small and deeply ignorant men, exactly who he really was. He could have pulled his diploma, his proof of a life, of a mind that they could not comprehend, out of his pocket, and he could have rubbed it in each and every one of their smug and deeply punchable faces. But then, he had thought of Eli and Nina. He had thought of their small, hungry faces, of their quiet, grateful eyes, and he knew that they were probably waiting for him, shivering, in the cold, dark, and lonely. He had taken a deep, steadying breath. He had adjusted the heavy bag of food on his shoulder, and he had kept walking. Manning and his friends had laughed even louder, interpreting his silence, his refusal to engage, as a sign of submission, of weakness. They had no idea what a profound and what a fatal mistake they were making. That same night, long after he had fed the two grateful, now sleeping, children, Thomas had sat down at the small worn kitchen table in the tiny apartment he shared with his mother, and he had opened an old, dusty notebook. He had begun to write names, dates, snippets of conversations he had overheard during his long and invisible months of waiting tables at the Golden Fork. During his time there, he had absorbed a vast and incredibly valuable amount of information about business deals, about secret partnerships, about elaborate and highly illegal tax schemes, and even some very revealing and very damaging, racist and misogynistic comments that the wealthy, powerful customers had made, thinking that the black waiter who was refilling their water glasses was nothing more than a piece of invisible and deaf furniture. One day he had muttered to himself, his pen scratching across the cheap, lined paper, "You will all find out that you underestimated the wrong, and very dangerous, person." 3 weeks later, Eli and Nina had simply and silently disappeared. Thomas had searched for them everywhere, his heart a cold, heavy, and deeply fearful stone in his chest. He had finally, after days of frantic, desperate searching, found out that they had been taken into the custody of the state, and had been sent to an orphanage, far away, in another, unknown, state. He had tried to visit them, to see them one last time, but he had been barred, no relatives, no visitation rights, and that had been the last, and most painful, straw, Thomas had realized, in that moment of profound, and deeply personal, loss, that dreaming of justice, that hoping for a better, more compassionate world, was not enough. He had to build it, with his own two strong, and now very determined hands. What those privileged, powerful men, in their gilded, and deeply corrupt, world, couldn't see, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that every single insult, every closed door, every denied opportunity, was not breaking him, it was forging him. It was forging something far more dangerous, far more formidable, than a simple, disgruntled waiter. It was creating a strategist, a quiet, patient, and brilliant strategist. A strategist who now knew all of their weaknesses, all of their secrets, better than they knew themselves, and who now had every single and very personal motivation in the world to use that knowledge against them, over the next 2 years. While Robert Manning was celebrating his easy and deeply satisfying victory over the problem waiter, while his own business, and his own arrogance, was expanding, Thomas Jefferson Santos was building something that none of them, in their wildest, most arrogant dreams, could ever have imagined. He worked 16, sometimes 18, hours a day, at a series of grueling, and often humiliating, jobs that barely paid the rent. He used every single, precious, free minute he had to put everything he had learned in his college business classes, all the theory, all the strategy, into a quiet, and very practical, practice. The old, dusty notebook, filled with its scribbled, and often desperate, notes, was transformed into a series of detailed, and meticulously organized, spreadsheet. The snippets of conversations he had overheard at the Golden Fork, when cross-referenced with public records, with business filings, with newspaper articles, revealed a deeply disturbing and highly illegal pattern. Robert Manning and his close circle of friends from the private club weren't just casual and deeply unpleasant racists. They were habitual and very sophisticated tax evaders. Thomas, with his sharp and highly trained analytical mind, uncovered decades of overpriced no-bid public works contracts, of ghost employees who existed only on paper, of elaborately and brilliantly manipulated receipts. He had names, he had dates, he had exact and very large amounts. His mother, Ruth, died on a cold rainy Tuesday in November. She died in his arms, in their small and now very quiet apartment, holding her son's hand and whispering her final and, most important, words of wisdom. "Don't let the anger consume you, my boy," she had said, her voice a faint and reedy whisper. "Use this pain, use all of this pain, to build something greater than yourself." Thomas had promised her right there, in that small, ornate, now very empty room, a room that had once been filled with her quiet and unwavering love, that he would do just that. It was at his mother's small and sparsely attended funeral that Thomas had met Dr. Marcus Chen. Dr. Chen was a brilliant and highly respected tax lawyer, a man who had been a college classmate and a close, personal friend of Thomas's mother. Decades earlier, Dr. Chen was the son of Chinese immigrants, and he knew, from his own, and often painful personal experience, the bitter and deeply corrosive taste of prejudice disguised as professional standards. "Your mother," Dr. Chen had said, as he had handed Thomas his business card, his own eyes full of a quiet and deeply sincere grief, "spoke of you often. She said you had the potential for great and wonderful things, but that the world, in its blindness, was trying to convince you otherwise." A week later, in Dr. Chen's small and cluttered downtown office, Thomas had shown him his notes. The lawyer had leafed through the pages of the old, worn notebook, and then through the meticulously organized spreadsheets, in a deep and profound silence. His eyes, which were usually sharp and analytical, had widened with each new and more damning revelation. "This," he had finally muttered, his voice a low and deeply impressed whisper, "is a tax bomb, a nuclear tax bomb. If even half of this information is true, it's all true." Thomas had interrupted, his own voice quiet but firm. "I was there, I heard them say it. They thought I was furniture. They thought I was invisible." Dr. Chen had closed the notebook slowly, his mind a brilliant and highly strategic legal instrument, already racing, already connecting the dots, already formulating a plan. "You have two options, Thomas," he had said. "You can hand all of this over to the IRS, and you can hope that they will, eventually, get around to investigating, or what?" Thomas had prompted. "Or," Dr. Chen had said, a slow and very dangerous smile spreading across his face, "we can build a case so solid, so well documented, so utterly and completely undeniable, that they will have no choice but to act immediately, and with the full and unforgiving force of the federal government." Meanwhile, Robert Manning's business and his arrogance had continued to grow, in a perfect and deeply symbiotic proportion. He had bought two of his main competing restaurants, always following the same and very successful pattern, mostly white and often incompetent employees in the prominent front-of-house positions, minimum and often illegal wages for the black and Hispanic kitchen and cleaning staff, and a series of lucrative and completely fraudulent contracts that existed only on paper. "Did you see that the thief waiter, the one I fired a few years ago, is now a janitor?" Manning had laughed during a business lunch with some of his cronies from the private club. "Karma, gentlemen, it works. People like that, they need to know their place in the world." What Manning, in his smug and deeply ignorant self-satisfaction, didn't know was that the janitor he was so gleefully and so publicly mocking now cleaned the very same office building where his own and very private accounting office was located, 3 times a week, and that during those long and very quiet months, Thomas Jefferson Santos, the man he thought he had destroyed, had photographed hundreds of incriminating documents, had copied entire and very secret spreadsheets, and had recorded dozens of very compromising and very illegal conversations through the thin and very porous walls of that office. Dr. Chen was, to put it mildly, impressed with Thomas's methodology. "You should have been a detective, Thomas," he had joked, as they had organized the mountains of new and even more damning, evidence into a series of themed and color-coded folders. This isn't just a complaint, this is a professional and deeply brilliant piece of investigative work. I had good teachers, Thomas had replied, a small and very private smile touching his lips, as he had remembered the scientific methodology classes he had so loved and had so excelled in college. The only difference is that now I have a very, very personal motivation. The turning point, the moment they had both been waiting for, had come when Thomas had discovered that Robert Manning was planning an even bigger and even more audacious expansion, a national chain of high-end and highly fraudulent restaurants, financed by a consortium of powerful and very discreet international investors. The entire multi-billion-dollar project, Thomas had discovered, depended on one and only one thing: a flawless and completely unblemished public image, and a series of very strict and very public government certifications. It's now, or it's never, Dr. Chen had said, his fingers tapping a restless and very excited rhythm on the surface of his small and cluttered office desk. If we let him close those deals, if he gets that international money, he will be too big, too powerful, too protected, to attack. Thomas had looked out of the small and dusty office window at the endless and indifferent movement of the city that had, for so long, so completely and so cruelly underestimated him. And in that moment, he had no longer felt like the humble and humiliated waiter of 2 years ago. He had felt like the brilliant and very dangerous strategist he had always, deep down, known himself to be. He believes he destroyed me, he had said, as he had turned to face Dr. Chen, his eyes now shining with a mixture of a cold and very precise determination, and a small and very human hint of a righteous and long overdue vengeance. He has no idea that all he did was give me the time and the motivation to prepare properly. Dr. Chen had nodded, a slow and very satisfied smile spreading across his face. He had recognized, in his new and very brilliant partner's eyes, the same deep and unquenchable hunger for justice that had motivated him, that had driven him throughout his own long and often difficult career. Then it's time, my friend, he had said. It's time to show him who really and truly knows how to play this game. The plan was ready. The evidence was organized. The right and very powerful contacts had been identified. Thomas had taken a deep and very steadying breath as he had remembered his mother's last and most important words about turning his pain into a building. Robert Manning had completely and fatally underestimated the power of a man who had nothing left to lose and a whole and much better world to gain. For months, everyone in that city had seen only a quiet and very invisible janitor cleaning their offices, emptying their trash cans. What they hadn't realized, what they couldn't possibly have known, was that they were watching a strategist, a brilliant and very patient strategist, a strategist who was quietly and very methodically gathering the ammunition for a war that Robert Manning didn't even know was about to begin. The first crack in Robert Manning's carefully constructed fortress of arrogance appeared on a Tuesday in March. It was a small, almost imperceptible crack, but it was the beginning of the end. His chief accountant, a nervous, perpetually sweating man named Peterson, called him in a state of barely controlled panic. Mr. Manning, there's an IRS audit team here, Peterson had stammered, his voice a high reedy squeak. They're asking for all of our financial documents from the last 5 years. Manning had laughed, a rich, confident, and deeply dismissive sound. He was standing at the massive floor-to ceiling window of his opulent 20th floor office, adjusting the knot of his expensive Italian silk tie, looking down at the city that he considered his personal kingdom. It's a routine audit, Peterson, he had said, his voice a smooth, calming purr. We're a solid and very successful company. Show them our books, we have nothing to hide. Sir, Peterson had replied, his voice now a desperate, terrified whisper. They're not asking for the official books. They have copies of documents. Documents I've never even seen before. Detailed spreadsheets, payment records, invoices. That shouldn't exist. Manning's confident, self-satisfied smile had frozen on his face. What do you mean, they shouldn't exist? They know, Sir, Peterson had whispered, his voice now barely audible. They know about the ghost employees. They know about the overpriced no-bid contracts. They even know about that account in the Cayman Islands. The one you said was top secret. Across town, in his small and now very quiet, apartment. Thomas Jefferson Santos was watching the morning news when his own phone had rung. It was Dr. Chen, and he was barely able to contain the triumphant and deeply satisfied satisfaction in his voice. "It has begun," he had said, his voice a simple and very powerful declaration. "The IRS accepted our anonymous and very well-documented complaint, and they have acted with a speed and a ferocity that is even faster than we had expected. They are going after everything, Thomas." 5 years of meticulously and chronologically organized evidence. Thomas had closed his eyes for a long, silent moment, and he had thought of his mother. She would be proud, he had murmured, his own voice thick with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel for a very, very long time. "But that's just the beginning, my friend," Dr. Chen had continued, his voice now full of a new and very dangerous excitement. "The Department of Justice has also been notified, and the city's health department has just received a very interesting and very detailed dossier on the suboptimal working conditions in all of Mr. Manning's fine dining establishments." A second crack in Manning's world had appeared just 2 days later. He was in the middle of a crucial and very delicate meeting with the consortium of international investors who were supposed to finance his grand national expansion. His assistant, a young and usually very composed woman, had rushed into the conference room, her face pale, her eyes wide with a new and very real panic. "Mr. Manning," she had stammered, There are journalists at the reception desk from the Times. They're asking about allegations of slave labor and massive tax evasion. They say the local newspaper is going to publish a major front-page story tomorrow." The lead investor, a stern and very precise German man named Herr Schmidt, had frowned, his cold blue eyes narrowing into 2 small and very dangerous slits. "What is the meaning of this, Mr. Manning?" he had asked, his voice alert and very menacing. "Rumble. Our company does not, under any circumstances, associate itself with questionable operations. It's a misunderstanding," Manning had stammered, feeling the hot and very unpleasant trickle of sweat run down his back. "A disgruntled former employee, probably. You know how it is. They get fired, and they make up stories." But when the newspaper had come out the next day, it was clear that this was no misunderstanding. The front-page story was a devastating and deeply brilliant piece of investigative journalism. It was filled with high-resolution photographs of incriminating documents, with detailed and very specific financial records, and with the emotional and very credible testimonials of dozens of former employees. The headline was a brutal and very public death sentence. Food empire, built on exploitation and tax evasion, the ugly truth behind Robert Manning's restaurant kingdom. The report had revealed everything. The systemic and deeply racist practice of paying black and Hispanic employees half the salary of their white counterparts for the exact same jobs. The degrading and often unsafe working conditions in the kitchens, the elaborate and highly illegal tax evasion schemes. But what was most shocking, what had truly captured the public's outrage, was a secret and very clear audio recording, which had been obtained by an anonymous source. In the recording, Robert Manning's voice was clearly and unmistakably heard saying, "Negroes have to know their place. I pay them the minimum wage because, let's be honest, that's all they're really worth." Manning had called the newspaper in a blind, sputtering rage. "Where did you get this?" he had screamed at the reporter. "This is a setup. This is a persecution." "Mr. Manning," the reporter had replied, his voice calm, professional, and utterly and completely unimpressed. "We have dozens of hours of similar recordings, sir. We have hundreds of incriminating documents, and we have the sworn and very detailed testimony of 42 of your former employees. Would you care to comment on any of that?" The third crack had not just been a crack. It had been a catastrophic and very public implosion. The international investors had cancelled the multi-billion-dollar contract immediately. The bank, citing the moral turpitude clause in their loan agreements, had frozen all of the company's accounts, and 3 of his flagship restaurants had had their operating licenses immediately and very publicly suspended by the city's health department. Employees, emboldened by the newspaper article and by the sudden and very welcome shift in the balance of power, had begun to sue the company en masse. It was during an emergency meeting with his team of very expensive and now very worried lawyers in a conference room that now looked and felt more like an interrogation chamber, that Robert Manning had received the phone call that would change his life forever. He had barked into the phone, "Who is this?" "Hello, boss," a calm, polite, and vaguely familiar voice had replied. The voice was tinged with a slight and very deliberate tone of irony that Manning couldn't, at first, immediately identify. "Who is this?" he had demanded again, his patience and his world rapidly disintegrating. "Thomas Jefferson Santos," the voice had replied. "Remember me? The waiter you fired 3 years ago for feeding 2 hungry orphan children?" The silence on the other end of the line was long, and it was heavy. The team of lawyers had watched as their client, the powerful and seemingly untouchable Robert Manning, had gradually and very visibly turned a pale and very unhealthy shade of gray. When he had finally spoken, his voice was a raw and very disbelieving whisper. "How?" he had asked. How did I get all of this information?" Thomas had finished for him, his own voice now a quiet and very satisfied smile. He was looking out of the window of his own new office. It was a small and very humble office, but it was honest. "Did you really think, Mr. Manning," he had continued, "that a man with a degree in business administration, a man who had graduated with straight A's, would just sit idly by, after being so publicly and so unjustly humiliated?" "That's impossible," Manning had stammered. You're a janitor." "I was," Thomas had replied, "for 3 very long and very educational years. I cleaned offices, Mr. Manning, including the very same office building where your own and very private accounting department is located. Do you have any idea how many very private and very incriminating conversations can be heard through thin and very cheap office walls? Do you have any idea how many very sensitive and very secret documents are left on desks when the people you consider to be invisible are cleaning up your mess?" Manning had felt his legs go weak. He had signaled frantically for his team of lawyers to leave the room, but they had hesitated. Their own professional and very morbid curiosity now piqued. They had realized that something very crucial and very interesting was happening. "You recorded my private conversations," Manning had hissed into the phone. "That's a crime." "A crime," Thomas's voice had replied, still impossibly and unnervingly calm, "is evading millions and millions of dollars in taxes. A crime is paying your black employees half the salary of your white employees for the exact same work. A crime, Mr. Manning, is creating a work environment that is based on a foundation of racial and deeply personal humiliation." His voice had remained calm, but it was now tinged with a new and very hard edge of steel. "I just documented the truth. What do you want?" Manning had asked, his voice now a desperate and very pathetic whisper. "Money. I can pay you. I can pay you a lot of money." Thomas had laughed, a soft, quiet, and deeply and profoundly satisfying sound. "Mr. Manning," he had said, "you still, after all of this, you still don't understand. I don't want anything from you, because I already have everything I need." What are you talking about?" "You know that secret and very illegal account you have in the Cayman Islands?" Thomas had asked. "The IRS already has all of the statements, and those overpriced and completely fraudulent contracts you have with all of those shell companies. They are already in the hands of the district attorney's office. And those very clear and very ugly recordings, where you talk about the importance of teaching black people their place, they have just been sent, anonymously, of course, to all of the local and national television stations." Manning had almost dropped the phone. That will destroy me," he had whispered, "completely." "No, Mr. Manning," Thomas had replied, his voice now a quiet and very final whisper. "You destroyed yourself. I just documented the process." At that very moment, his assistant had rushed back into the room, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "Mr. Manning," she had stammered, "your employees, they are quitting en masse. The union is at the front door, and then there's a TV crew here. They want an interview." Manning had covered the phone with his hand. "Tell them I'm not here," he had hissed. "They said they have the recordings of you." "Sir," she had replied, her own voice now trembling, "they said they can and will publish them without your side of the story, if you prefer." "Mr. Manning," Thomas's voice, still calm, still polite, was still on the line. "Are you still there?" "Why?" Manning had whispered, his voice now a broken and very defeated sound. "Why are you doing this to me?" "Because you made a choice, Mr. Manning," Thomas had replied, 3 years ago. "You chose to humiliate a man who was just trying to feed 2 hungry, and very scared. Children, you chose to spread lies about me, to ensure that I would never be able to find a decent, an honest, job again. You chose to treat other human beings as if they were disposable, and very inconvenient, trash. Manning had looked out of the window of his opulent, and now very empty, office, at the growing crowd that was gathering in the street below. He could see the cameras, the microphones, the angry, and very righteous, posters, with words he couldn't quite read from up there, but whose content he could, with a sickening, and very final, certainty, imagine. I was just a businessman, he had stammered, a last, pathetic, and deeply revealing, attempt at a justification. I was just trying to protect my business. And Thomas had replied, his voice now a quiet, and very powerful, echo of his mother's own, and very wise words, was just a son, trying to take care of his sick mother. The difference between us, Mr. Manning, is that I never, not once, had to step on other people to get what I wanted. That afternoon, when the last of his terrified, and now very disloyal, employees had left the office, carrying their small, and very personal, boxes of belongings, Robert Manning was left completely, and utterly, alone, in the vast, and now very silent, room. His secretary had resigned, by email. His chief accountant had disappeared, without a trace. Even the doorman of the building, a man he had known, and had barely acknowledged, for years, had greeted him with a new, and very cold, look in his eyes. Across town, Thomas had received another call from Dr. Chen, the German investors, he had said, his voice full of a new, and very excited, energy. They want to talk to you. They are, to put it mildly, impressed with your investigative methodology. Apparently, they are looking for someone with your very specific and very unique set of skills, for their own, and very private, internal auditing department. Thomas had smiled, a genuine, and very hopeful, smile, as he had remembered his mother's last, and most important, words, about turning his pain into a building. Robert Manning had tried to break his spirit, but all he had done, in the end, was forge him into something much, much stronger. On the television that night, the images of the spectacular, and very public, fall of the Manning Empire had dominated the news. His former employees had given emotional, and very powerful, testimonials about the years of discrimination, of humiliation, of abuse they had endured. Financial experts had explained, in great, and very damning, detail, how his massive, and very illegal, tax evasion schemes had affected the city's essential public services, and at the very center of it all was the one, and very tantalizing, question that no one, not the reporters, not the experts, not the public, could answer. Who was the anonymous, and very brilliant source who had obtained such a vast, and such a devastating amount of evidence? Manning, who was watching the broadcast from his now empty, and very silent, apartment. The mansion had been repossessed by the bank that morning, knew exactly who it was. The waiter, the janitor, the invisible man he had so casually, and so cruelly, fired, as if he were a bug, had become the brilliant, and very patient, architect of his own, and very complete, ruined art, as Manning had sat there, in the dark, contemplating the smoldering ruins of his own, and very self-inflicted arrogance. One final, and very important, question had remained. Could the spectacular, and very public, fall of an empire that had been built on a foundation of prejudice, and of hate, teach us anything about the true, and very high, price of humility? And when all the ashes had finally settled, who would, truly, and finally, emerge victorious from this long, and very silent, war, that had been waged in the deep, and very dark, shadows of injustice? 6 months after the spectacular, and very public, fall of the Manning Empire, Thomas Jefferson Santos was sitting in his own, new, office. It was no longer the small and humble, but honest, space he had occupied just a few months before. It was an elegant, and very spacious, penthouse office, in the very heart of the city's financial center. The auditing firm he had founded with Dr. Chen, a firm that specialized in investigating and exposing discriminatory labor practices in large and powerful corporations, was growing exponentially. Ironically, the Manning case had become a famous and very popular case study in business schools all across the country. It was a perfect, and very powerful, example of how meticulous, and very patient, documentation, and a brilliant, and very precise, strategy, could bring down even the most seemingly untouchable, and very corrupt, systems. Thomas now gave lectures at universities, and he always told the same and very simple story. The best revenge, he would say, his voice quiet but firm, is not in destroying your enemy. It is in building something that he, in his small and very limited world, could never, ever have imagined. Robert Manning, on the other hand, had lost everything. He was bankrupt. His reputation was destroyed. He now worked as the night manager at a gas station on the desolate and very lonely outskirts of the city. His former and very powerful friends from the private club would greet him with a cold and very dismissive look in their eyes on the rare and very awkward occasions when they would occasionally run into him. His arrogance had been replaced by a quiet and very corrosive bitterness, and by the belated and very painful realization that he had completely and fatally underestimated the wrong man. The news of his downfall had been circulating for months. The multi-million-dollar lawsuits, the ongoing and very public federal investigations, even a congressional inquiry into the systemic and very ugly discrimination in the city's food service industry. Robert Manning had become the national and very pathetic symbol of how a deep and very systemic prejudice could destroy not only the innocent lives of others, but also the very and very arrogant perpetrators of that injustice. It was on a sunny and very beautiful Thursday afternoon that Thomas had heard the sound of the helicopter blades. He was in the middle of reviewing a series of complex and very interesting contracts when his assistant had rushed into his office, her eyes wide with a new and very excited energy. "Mr. Santos," she had said, "there's a helicopter. It's landing on the building's helipad, and then there are two people here. They are asking to speak with you." Thomas had smiled, a genuine and very warm smile, as if he had been expecting this very moment for a very, very long time. 20 years had passed since he had last seen Eli and his sister Nina, but something in his heart, a quiet and very certain voice, had always known that their paths would, one day, cross again. When the elevator doors had opened, he had recognized them immediately. Eli was now a tall and very elegant businessman, the owner and the founder of a national chain of ethical and very successful restaurants that specifically and very proudly employed people in vulnerable and often overlooked social situations. And Nina, his sister, had become a renowned and very brilliant human rights lawyer, a woman who specialized in cases of racial and very systemic discrimination. Thomas, Elia had said, as he had extended his hand, his own face breaking into a wide and very grateful smile, a smile that was a mixture of a deep and very abiding gratitude and a new and very profound admiration. "We knew we would meet again, someday. You've grown up," Thomas had replied, his own voice now thick with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel for a very, very long time. "And you have both become exactly what I always knew you would be." Nina had opened a folder, and she had shown him a collection of newspaper clippings, of online articles, of detailed and very impressive reports on the Manning case. "We followed everything," she had said, her own eyes now shining with a mixture of pride and of a deep and very personal satisfaction. "When we saw your name in the news, when we read the details of the case, we knew immediately who you were. The man who fed us, when we were just too scared and very hungry children," Eli had added, his own voice now a low and very emotional rumble, "had become the man who had brought down an entire empire that had been built on a foundation of prejudice and of hate. It was not a coincidence, it was justice." The three of them had talked for hours. Eli had told him how he had built his restaurant chain, always keeping in mind the quiet and very powerful lessons that Thomas had taught him all those years ago about dignity, about compassion, and about caring for the most vulnerable among us. And Nina had explained how every single and very difficult case she won in court was a quiet and very personal tribute to the man who had shown her, at a very young and very impressionable age, that kindness and strategy could and should go hand in hand. "You know," Nina had said, as she had pulled a yellowed and very carefully preserved piece of paper from her bag, "we always kept that drawing we made for you. It was a simple and very childish drawing of a tall and very strong figure standing in the middle of a storm, protecting two very small and very scared children. But now it was framed with a simple and very elegant frame, a frame of love and of reverence." Thomas had hugged them both, a long and very emotional hug, feeling, in that moment, that a circle, a long and very painful and very beautiful circle, had been perfectly and very finally closed. "You know I did it for you, too, right?" he had said, his own voice now a whisper. "Every single, and very incriminating, document I photographed, every single, and very damning, recording I made, was with the memory of the two very small, and very scared, children in my mind. The children who might have to go through what the two of you went through." Nina had then pulled another, and very different document from her folder. "Actually," she had said, her own voice now full of a new, and very exciting, energy, "we came here today with a proposal. We want to create a foundation, together. Programs that will identify at-risk children, and that will connect them with real, and very meaningful, opportunities for growth," Eli had added, his own eyes now shining with a new, and very powerful, sense of purpose. "And restaurants that will serve as vocational training centers, places where people like us, and like you, once were," Nina had added, her own voice now a quiet, and very powerful whisper, "can find not just a job, but a new, and very real, sense of dignity. We have interested investors," Eli had continued, "we have government support, and we have a network of powerful, and very compassionate, business people who want to participate. But we need someone," Nina had added, her own gaze now direct, and very clear, "who understands that social justice isn't just about talk, it's about concrete, and very strategic, action." That afternoon, as the three of them had sat there, in that elegant, and very powerful, penthouse office, planning the future of their new, and very hopeful, foundation, Thomas had looked out of the panoramic window at the city below, the city that had, for so long, so completely, and so cruelly, underestimated him, the city that was now in a very real, and very tangible, sense. At his feet, Robert Manning was still somewhere out there, in that same, and very indifferent, city. He was probably brooding over his defeat, over his ruin, trying, in his small, and very limited, mind, to understand how he had been so completely, and so brilliantly, beaten by someone he had considered to be his inferior. But Thomas no longer felt any anger towards him. He felt only a quiet, and very profound satisfaction at having proven that intelligence, and patience, and integrity will always, in the end, defeat arrogance and prejudice. 2 years later, the Santos Ilanina Foundation had become a national benchmark in the fight against discrimination, and for a new, and very real, social inclusion. More than 500 children had already benefited from their innovative, and very successful, educational programs. 2,000 families had received free, and very effective, legal advice. And 8 new, and very beautiful, restaurant schools were now operating, and thriving. In different states all across the country. Thomas appeared regularly in the media, no longer as the humble and humiliated waiter, but as the brilliant, and very respected, strategist who had completely, and irrevocably, changed the paradigm of how to fight corporate, and very systemic, injustice. His auditing firm had become the quiet, and very real, nightmare of prejudiced, and very corrupt businessmen all across the country. During an interview on national television, the host had asked him, "Mr. Santos, what would you say to the people out there who are experiencing the same kind of discrimination, the same kind of injustice, that you once did?" Thomas had smiled, a genuine, and very warm, smile, as he had adjusted the lapels of the expensive, and very well-tailored suit he now wore with an easy, and very natural, grace. "But the difference between revenge, and justice," he had said, his voice quiet, but firm, "is a very simple one. Revenge destroys. Justice builds. Robert Manning tried to destroy me, but all he ended up doing was teaching me that I could be much, much greater than he, in his small and very limited world, could ever have imagined. The best revenge, he now knew, had been exactly what his mother, in her infinite, and very profound wisdom, had always said it was, to turn your pain into a building." Robert Manning had tried to break Thomas Jefferson Santos, but all he had done, in the end, was forge him into something much, much stronger. And now, every single, and very hopeful, child who was helped by their foundation was a new, and very beautiful, victory over all the Robert Mannings of the world.